All right, well, it's time to get started with the class here and start going over the textbook and some information. Let me tell you, for those of you who are not aware of how this game works, I'm going to be lecturing here. There's some basic fundamental knowledge in the field of neuroscience that you need to understand. The name of your class at Mary Baldwin College is called Physiological Psychology. At other colleges, it's called Biological Psychology. Where I teach it at Jefferson College, and I gave it the name, it's called neuroscience. For me, those terms are somewhat synonymous. They mean very similar things. In biological psychology, though, what we tend to do in a class that's called that is we really examine the brain for the sake of understanding what the brain does, how the brain works, and so forth. The purpose of this class for you folks in the ADP program is going to be a little different. I know a whole lot about how medications work and how people take different drugs and how they work as well. So I'm going to try to be a little more applied than kind of the basic neuroscience or physiological approach here. So hopefully you get that idea. What I want you to do with these outlines, and I just have one spot for outlines here, but the idea is I want you to put together outlines, but it's kind of tricky here because the other thing I'm really looking for is words written down that I can see that you understand what I'm talking about here. So it's a little more than just having outlines of information. I've given you the agenda here, but I want to see you kind of type out sentences and information in a somewhat organized way that shows that you understand the key principles that we're talking about with these lectures. And the reason that I start with some lectures here is there's just some very basic fundamental knowledge that I feel like you need to have, and I can start lecturing right away for this information. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to start off with chapter 1. We're going to start off with a spelling error of mine. Descartes is not spelled that way if you look on page 3. We're going to talk about this issue of mind and body. Are you guys familiar with the issue of mind and body? So somebody has trouble paying attention. Attention might be a cognitive variable, a mind variable. Is there a neurobiological root to that? So is there a relationship between what happens in your mind? Mind might be cognitive, mind might be perceptual, and what happens in the physiology of your brain. And in the very beginnings of biological psychology, Descartes actually postulated the idea that was called dualism, that there is a mind and a body, and they do exist, but actually there is no relationship between them. So this was called dualism. And Descartes came up with this idea of dualism. You can add a little detail from the book if you want from page 3, but dualism basically said, yes, there is a body, yes, there is a mind, but they are separate. And if you're in psychology, you can study the mind, and if you're in religion, you can study the mind, and if you're a physician, if you look on page 4 with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath and Aristotle, those folks can study the body. So the idea that the mind and body were separate was the principle in regards to dualism. Well, if that really did tend to exist, this idea of dualism, then we wouldn't have this class. Because I'm sure, as most of you believe, and I believe as well, there is a relationship between what happens at a cognitive level and what happens at a physiological level. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of that relationship. The idea behind that is that they're related, is called the position of monism, that there's a relationship between the mind and body. If you believe in monism, there are two types of monism. One type is called type reductionism, that you could take any one state or any one physiological situation and it would map directly to something perceptual. So the idea might be, if perception is mind and physiology is body, in the field of sensation and perception, they actually discovered that there are cells in our brain that seem to respond selectively, one individual neuron to each different face that we see. This idea is, if you see one face that you recognize, it's this one neuron. If you see another face that you recognize, it's another neuron. These cells were called grandmother cells. And if you believe in this idea that there is one neuron for every face we recognize, then face recognition, a perception, would map directly to a neuron in the brain. That might be what we call type reductionism. type reductionism says there's a one-to-one relationship. Any one mental state you could take and reduce it to a physiological state. And it's a perfect relationship. So that's called type reductionism. There's not too many people who believe in this idea of type reductionism. What people tend to believe is that there's something more called token reductionism. Token reductionism. Let's say we take a clinical disease like depression. When people are clinically depressed, what a lot of people believe is that there are some commonalities among the brain chemistry. Depression is a clinical state. You have feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness. Those could be mind states. And that there is a correlation between what happens in the mind and what happens in the body, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's called token reductionism. So we believe in this particular class in the position called monism. We believe that there is a relationship between mind and body. There might not be a one-to-one relationship, a perfect relationship where you can take any mental state and reduce it to a physiological state. We believe there are some commonalities. Most people who are depressed, there's probably something wrong with their serotonin or some of their other neurochemistry, but it's not a perfect match. So if you believe in token reductionism, you believe there is a relationship between mind and body, but it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship. So that takes us through the first part of this. Let's keep going. You can read a little more in your book and add some details from there if you wish. Phrenology. Got to talk a little bit about phrenology. The idea behind phrenology was actually the idea behind reductionism a bit. The idea that you could just say there are different geographical centers on the brain that correspond to different mental states. The idea of mapping mental states to anatomical locations is certainly kind of a mind-body thing. This area of the brain controls this, that area of the brain controls that. So that's what Gall did. Unfortunately, a lot of this work turned out to be untrue. So that was the study of phrenology. You can add a little more about that in your notes as you wish as well. Let's see what else we've got in Chapter 1. We'll get back to Phineas Gage here. Some other things that I know about, but I don't necessarily want to share with you now because this is an ADP class. The synapse. There was a big debate for a long time if between the different neurons up in the brain, if there were any gaps there. And it was only at the advent of the electron microscope that somebody by the name of Sherrington was able to actually see that there were little gaps, little synapses between things. And so the idea there is the synapse is that key area for studying what's going on with neurochemicals. What else do we have to share with you? Techniques of human neuroscience. So this is a little more in Chapter 1. If we're going to look at the techniques in the brain to study things, there are a number of techniques that can be used. You can see this on future pages. Let's see, techniques of human neuroscience. So you've got things like the CAT scan. That's just a static picture of the brain. You can see that on page 15. An MRI is also a picture of the brain, once again as well. PET scan is using glucose to take a picture of the brain. I don't think we see that picture here. You could also take an EEG, which is actually recording the electricity coming from your brain. That's something that neuroscientists use. And a PET scan. There's a PET scan on page 17 and 18. The key with the PET scan is now with some of these things, actually it looks like on page 18, they talk about a functional MRI, and actually there's a functional PET scan where you can actually observe things not in the static brain, but while the brain is processing information. You give somebody something to memorize and you see what happens with brain utilization. The brighter colors mean the brain is using glucose more in these areas. So the functional MRI and the PET scan can actually be used to look at how things are working in the live brain over time. And finally, last but not least, we have animal neuroscience. I told you I have a big background in the neurosciences. If you look on page 14, you'll see that as a animal neuroscientist, we used to use what's called the stereotaxic instrument. And it's very interesting. We used to anesthetize the rat. You can go into the brain of the rat And basically, there's like a navigational scale. If you go into exactly on the right spot, I'm not sure if the book says it or not, but it's called bregma, B-R-E-G-M-A. It was a spot right in the center of the brain. They can tell you go up 2 millimeters, go down 2 millimeters, and then you can be in different structures of the brain. We have to follow strong ethics when we're working with humans or animals. Those are instituted by the Institutional Review Board. I don't know if your book mentions that. Maybe or maybe not. If you look on page 20 for the animal science stuff, you can see they can put products in the brain to see what different areas do if you put different drugs in there. So that's kind of what we do. I'm not going to talk about the different fields. Now it looks like on page 25, the Institutional Review Board at any college will review any procedures you want to do to humans or animals, and they will let you know if you can do that kind of research. So that is my information on Chapter 1. Your job, should you choose to accept it, is to basically provide an outline of this background material. I hope this was okay with you. That's it for me.